Well, welcome everybody to tonight's public lecture by Professor Jeff Sachs. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we meet tonight, the people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present and to any other elders who are here tonight. And I think we should also acknowledge that Indigenous Australians have cared for country for many tens of thousands of years, which surely is a lesson in sustainability that we should study and learn from. I'd like to welcome you tonight and welcome our special guest, Jeff Sachs. I'm John Thwaites and I'm the chair of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. We are a Monash-wide research institute and an education institute and an action institute. That is, we believe we have to bring together research, education and action to meet these great challenges of sustainable development. All countries, including Australia, have signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. They have bipartisan support in Australia. But the real test is what action that we take to implement them. Universities will be absolutely critical if we're going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The research will provide the knowledge and the solutions, the education that will train the next generation of leaders, and the action that we take in the community, jointly with business and government and civil society, to transform the way we do things to ensure that we truly are sustainable. When the United Nations was starting to draft the Sustainable Development Goals back in 2012, the then Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, asked Professor Jeff Sachs to set up a global network of universities to get behind the Sustainable Development Goals, to help design them and then help implement them. And Jeff Sachs did just that, and he set up the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. That's now a network of more than 700 universities and knowledge institutions right around the world dedicated to successfully implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. As well as that, Jeff is now the special advisor to the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, on the Sustainable Development Goals. And he's personally advising many governments and heads of state on how we should implement them. Soon after the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, the SDSN, was set up, Monash, and particularly the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, was asked to be the regional centre for the SDSN for Australia, Pacific and New Zealand. And I'm really pleased to say that we now have 31 universities and knowledge institutions in our region that are part of the SDSN. But more importantly, we're working together to help provide the research and the knowledge needed to implement the goals. We jointly organised with civil society Australia's SDG Summit earlier this year. We helped bring together all the community groups to inform Australia's voluntary national review. And just recently we published a report with other organisations and with the National Sustainable Development Council on how well Australia is performing in implementing the goals. And that report you can download. If you simply download it using SDG Transforming Australia, you'll see where we're going well, health and education, and where we're not doing well, particularly in climate change. As you might have seen from the video, a few years back, a group of students got together and set up SDSN Youth. And there are now hundreds of student organisations around the world that are part of SDSN Youth, helping to educate young people about the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, why is all this activity happening? Well, obviously it's because we are committed to a different sort of a world that's much more sustainable. But it has required someone to bring us together and inspire us. And really that person has been Professor Jeff Sachs. He has managed to get all of these universities working together with business and governments around the world on this big task of Sustainable Development Goal implementation. And as well as advising governments and heads of state, I think Professor Sachs has another ability, and that is to talk direct to all of us, to the public, through his writing, through his books. And testament to that is that there are so many people here tonight, a full house of people who've come to listen to Jeff. Jeff Sachs, of course, is a world-renowned economist. He's a leader in sustainable development. He's the co-recipient of the 2015 Blue Planet Prize, which is the leading global prize for environmental leadership. He's twice been named among Time magazine's 100 most influential world leaders, and the New York Times describes him as probably the most important economist in the world. But he's not just a brilliant thinker and writer. It's his moral suasion and his practical advice that has helped dozens of countries and heads of state to tackle the really difficult challenges of sustainable development, ending poverty, fighting climate change, reducing inequality. And I would now like to welcome to the stage Professor Sachs to address us on a new age of sustainable development, Australia, Asia and the world. Professor Sachs.
Wow. Thank you so much, John, and all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out to share the evening to talk about these important topics. It's really inspiring for me, and I'm full of admiration for this beautiful city and a wonderful country and a wonderful network of colleagues around this region that John and his colleagues have assembled. So many good things have come from the leadership of SDSN Australia in helping universities around the world take up these challenges, in new ideas about analyses on decarbonization, and now a project that we formally launched this morning at Monash University on how to integrate land use and climate issues into a coherent strategy for agriculture, energy, and climate. As John Thwaites just mentioned, SDSN Youth emerged from the students at Monash University and now is a global network. And we'll be meeting SDSN Youth in a global gathering at the Vatican in just a couple of weeks, which is extraordinarily exciting. But you can imagine young people coming from all over the world to talk about the ethical commitment and the practical ways forward on the Sustainable Development Goals. Tonight, I want to share with you some observations of where we are on this challenge. And try to puzzle out with you, why is this so hard? It shouldn't be so hard. This is for us. It makes sense. It's important. It's important for our well-being. It's important for our children and our grandchildren's generation, crucial for them. This should be the work of every politician, business person, citizen around the world. And I think when people are aware of these issues, they feel that way. But I'm also going to share some of the realities of how weird the world is, that even when it's a matter of life and death, we sometimes simply are unable to get our act together. Let me start with the good, the bad, and some more. The good. The world is incredibly rich right now. The IMF estimates the total output of the world by adding the gross domestic products of the 193 UN member states together to get a gross world product. It does that with a lot of technical definitions of measuring these economies at so-called international prices. When it does that calculation, the total value of output in the world is now about $130 trillion a year. There are a lot of people in the world, 7.6 billion people. 130 trillion divided by 7.6 billion is an average output per person of about $18,000 per year on this standard. That's not bad for a big, crowded, diverse world. It's rather amazing. It's the result of 200-some years of economic growth that started with the Industrial Revolution and has continued until today with some ups and some very devastating down periods of war and depression. But we've arrived at a world that on average is rich, a world where you look at that average number of $18,000 and you could see immediately there's no need for poverty, much less extreme poverty in this world. That should be absolutely an anachronism. The world is rich because we have amazing technological systems that allow us to do absolutely astounding things. I was speaking with the provost of Monash University just a moment ago. He's a civil engineer. I bow to all engineers. Engineers make the world work. They don't always get the glory, but they are the ones that actually make the world economy work. Without the engineering, there's nothing. If it were just economists, oh my God, I won't even go into it, how bad that would be. But a lot of the people that we know, the famous names, the Steve Jobs and others, you know, they've done their thing, but they are building on the genius of engineering systems. And these systems are what make it possible for 7.6 billion people, a lot of people, 10 times more than at the start of this industrial age 2 centuries ago, to be able to have this chance of prosperity. I'm drawn to one particular system. You can probably guess why. That is civil aviation. A day hardly passes when I'm not on an airplane, so I think about airplanes a lot. And the civil aviation system, which by definition is only a little more than a century old, after all, the first flight was 1903 of the Wright brothers, civil aviation last year took 4 billion passengers around the world with about 40 million flights. And astoundingly, there were only 6 flights with fatalities out of that 40 million flights. That is a system that works astoundingly well. I fly into a lot of places that I'm not too thrilled to be at, frankly, and don't feel too safe when I get out of the plane. But I feel perfectly safe landing and taking off from those places because it's better than 1 in a million, less than 1 in a million flights, that is, that has a fatality. This is a system that works. And the world operates on such systems. Our smartphones, our connectivity, the internet, our payment systems, the trillions of dollars that change hands every day, the systems of transport and logistics that bring food to most of the world on a reliable basis, on a daily basis, that for most of the world, though hardly all of the world right now, make the water that comes out of the tap safe to drink, and provides a sewerage system that avoids epidemic diseases in our urban areas. These systems work. That's why we can think about sustainable development, ending the climate crisis, protecting biodiversity, ensuring that every child is in school, ensuring that everybody has health care, as an absolutely pragmatic engineering task, basically. It's extending systems like civil aviation and other spheres. The analogy actually works, by the way, though I won't be able to elaborate in detail on any of these other systems. There's just no reason in our world today why a child should lack a classroom and a qualified teacher as a place to learn. There's no reason why any of us or any other person in any other country should not be able to see a health worker, especially when bitten by a mosquito that may carry malaria, for example, or a mom who is pregnant to get an antenatal visit, or to be in a place with an emergency obstetrical theater during childbirth. These are systems issues that are within our engineering reach, and not even at any great heroism to bring that about. So the bad. The bad is it's nothing like that in the world for most of the areas of our life. Take our energy and climate system. Our energy system is killing us now. It's killing thousands. It will kill tens of thousands soon. It can kill hundreds of thousands because of the climate change effects. We could be devastating the planet within years at the rate we're going in terms of the human-induced global warming. Last year, the United States lost thousands of lives to 3 major hurricanes that hit last fall, the most devastating being a hurricane that ripped through Puerto Rico and claimed between 3,000 and 6,000 lives, depending on the range of uncertainty in 2 epidemiological studies. These few storms cost $300 billion of damages in the United States alone, and then you consider the droughts in this country, the forest fires, the devastation of heat waves, crop failures all over the world. And that is continuing relentlessly now, and we can't get our act together to move. And between Canberra and Washington, you just hold your hands in amazement. What is going on? You can fly 4 billion passengers safely, but you can't have a coherent, sensible discussion about energy systems? That's our world. Another similar perversity of our world is that more than 5 million kids died last year of poverty because they could not get access to the most basic primary health care, vaccines or curative antibiotics or rehydration or anti-malarials, or that they were not noticed by a formal health system for deep undernourishment, and there was no very low-cost rescue of nutrient supplementation. So 5.4 million kids under the age of 5 died last year, essentially of poverty. I take that as a systems failure. I take it as a shockingly weird fact. It made no headline anywhere. But it is the reality that is the same world that is able to clear trillions of dollars of payment settlements in a day, or have 10,000 aircraft safely in the air at any moment, or safely and accurately convey petabytes of data seemingly effortlessly to 7.5 billion mobile phone subscribers. And our world, the same world, has nearly 70 million people displaced by conflict right now. And this also, I'm going to suggest in a few minutes, is a systems failure. It's not just bloody-mindedness, it's systemic bloody-mindedness. A lot of it starts in Washington, D.C. It's not accidental what's happening. And we're not focused and paying attention and using our expert knowledge to solve that. So there's the good, there's the bad, and there's the ridiculous. Two engineering minds. How can it be that we're in their hands after all of this knowledge, after all of our capacity and all of these needs? Of course, we're in their hands in two different ways. One is a septuagenarian billionaire, the other an octogenarian billionaire. They are both avidly fighting science and truth every day. They're partners in that. President Trump is a psychopath, technically speaking. And quite seriously, the world of American psychologists and psychiatrists is profoundly alarmed and have made me profoundly alarmed. He's a dangerous man, and he's a mentally unstable man. And he has no business being in the White House even as a tourist, as far as I'm concerned, much less as a president. And Rupert Murdoch is his accessory in this, because Rupert Murdoch basically runs a PR firm for the White House called Fox News and the Wall Street Journal and News Corp, which are propaganda instruments for some of the worst in our world today. So for me, this is the paradox, that we have incredible capacity to solve problems. We have profound challenges that are extraordinarily dangerous, that are claiming millions of lives per year, that threaten the survival of millions of species, that threaten the habitability of large parts of the planet, and that threaten our self-annihilation, frankly. And I'm sorry to be so glum and blunt about it, but believe me, when you hear about adults in the room that are keeping us safe, don't believe it, because we are not safe, and we're not safe in the hands of politicians that are able to do and say the crazy things that our politicians are able to say. And that is the puzzle. And our situation is, I hope, understandably reflected in this way. We have an arrow of time, this downward sloping black line. On the horizontal axis, I'm measuring wealth. And on the vertical axis, I'm measuring environmental quality. For the last 70 years, we've been getting wealthier at the expense of the environment. The arrow is pointing towards more wealth, but lower environmental quality. We're hitting a line now, just now, that the ecologists, including many Australian ecologists who are world leaders in this field, call planetary boundaries. It means that our scale of human activity is now so large, whether it is in the emissions of greenhouse gases or the conversion of land surface or the claims on fresh water or the consequences of atmospheric carbon dioxide dissolving in the oceans and acidifying the oceans, or the pollution we're causing of microplastics in the oceans, or the destruction of habitat of species as we clear peatlands and savanna and forest lands for yet more pasture or more palm oil or more soybeans. We're facing boundary conditions where if we exceed these boundaries, we destroy whole biomes. We lead to the collapse of habitat, species, and biodiversity, or we reach a level of human-induced global warming that not only would cause harms to multiply dramatically of the sort that we're already seeing, heat waves, droughts, floods, forest fires, extreme typhoons, cyclones, hurricanes, all of that, but could set off countless feedback processes: permafrost release of methane, degassing of the oceans, change of the land surface, the albedo, and so on, that could dramatically push us into uncontrollable climate change. We know this scientifically, and we're just there right now. By there, I mean our generation. Maybe we're already on the other side of that planetary boundary line. We don't know. One of my colleagues, James Hansen, who for 30 years was NASA's lead climate scientist, says we're already past the safety zone. He defines that as the climate of our civilizational era called the Holocene. The last 10,000 years, he says, we're already warmer than in any decade average of the last 10,000 years. And we're still on a rapid ascent of mean surface temperature. Well, when we pass that planetary boundary, a lot of horrible things are going to happen. Our ability to grow food, our ability of populations around the world to have a safe habitat that isn't flooded or destroyed by ever more intense cyclones, or that isn't deluged by rising sea levels, or that doesn't lose the biodiversity that makes the crops pollinate and that enables the food to be grown. So that's the idea, that you continue past that planetary boundary, and then instead of wealth increasing, we have a dramatic reversal of average well-being on the planet and a continuing environmental catastrophe through continued feedback mechanisms. Of course, what we need to do, instead of following that red line down in a downward spiral and a collapse of prosperity, is to follow the dotted green line towards sustainable development. Sustainable development means getting richer, which is important for a lot of the world population that doesn't live like we live in Melbourne or in New York City, or in the 1/6 of the world in the so-called developed countries, so-called, but countries that have the greatest extensive use of modern technologies. But to do so in a way that improves environmental quality. How do you turn the arrow from the downward slope of the solid black line, which is the historical record, to the upward green slope of sustainable development? We have to change technological systems, basically. It's a systems transformation. For energy, it's simple. In a way, simple to describe in one sentence, and that is to go from coal, oil, and gas to wind, solar, hydro, and other zero-carbon energy sources. That's the one sentence. The two sentences are, and to do it by mid-century, so that we don't have a complete blowout of the climate system. That's the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was released last week. It said, by the way, and you just find it online, IPCC 1.5 degrees C is the report. Take a look. It's all, there's a summary for policymakers. That means it's really simple. It says there's no room for coal in any safe scenario. It didn't say maybe 21st century, oh, just a little bit, oh, just Australia. It didn't say anything like that. It said none. Look it up. It actually said 0 to 2%. I have to be more precise. The end of the coal era, which started with James Watt in 1776. It's coming to an end. Plan for it. This is a rich, sophisticated country. You'll do just fine, but plan for it. Instead, your Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. McCormick, made a statement the next day that it didn't out-Trump Trump. You can't do that. But it sounded like an acolyte of Trump. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, "We're not going to be pushed around by any report of any kind like that. That's not going to tell us what to do." Mr. McCormick, what's the point of a world scientific community working for decades to keep us safe? And you didn't even read the report, not one word of it. And then to dismiss it that way, is that your job as Deputy Prime Minister? No, it is not. Your job is to protect the people of this country and the world. So you should read the report and take it seriously and not say those things. That's the puzzle for me. How can we have the world of such incredible sophistication and such failure? The difference is, of course, that Mr. McCormick flies planes. So he doesn't say, "I don't care about that dumb air traffic control system." He takes it seriously. Seriously means stay out of it. And seriously here would mean get your best engineers to ask, how do you engineer a safe energy system? That's what it means. Well, there's another aspect to this worth emphasizing, and that is that we really have 3 dimensions. I'm just not good enough to draw 3 dimensions on a PowerPoint slide, so I did it in 2 slides. I confess, I'm sure there's a way to make the z-axis come out of the screen, but I don't know how to do it. I'm too old. But on this axis, the wealth is also increasing, but what's going down is social inclusion, what's sometimes called social capital. Or another way to put it is that wealth inequality and income inequality are soaring. Not everywhere, but in the United States, they're soaring, for example. We have become a country of the few rich and a lot of poor people. We've become a country weird enough that if you have a college degree, your life expectancy and health are rising every year. But if you have a high school degree or less, your death rates are going up and your life expectancy is going down. That's our society. It's coming apart. Well, we're hitting a line that is like that planetary boundary line that might be called a social instability line, that we reach a degree of social incapacity that we really can't function. I think Mr. Trump is exhibit A in this. We actually can't have a coherent, we can't solve any problems in the United States right now, by the way. That's not because the country is polarized, that's because we're having a political nervous breakdown. We cannot solve any problems in the United States right now. Look at those Kavanaugh hearings, how weird it is. Let's do an investigation. The FBI gets 4 minutes. Ask 3 people. We can't think anymore. You want to investigate something? Take a few days. No, because it's all shambolic. It's not real. The politics don't work. And so that is the social instability line. That could also be pretty catastrophic for us. Sustainable development says no. We can have growth that is more socially inclusive, not less socially inclusive. Mr. Bezos doesn't really need a tax cut when he's worth $160 billion, one person. I'm not talking about Amazon, I'm talking about Mr. Bezos. But it was the compulsive, vital urge of the American political system to give Mr. Bezos another tax cut. And you can be sure that Rupert was there cheerleading this effort every day so that he and his family could get tax cuts as well. And the wealth taxes and the estate taxes and all the rest. That's a kind of social craziness that we're suffering as well. Sustainable development says, no, we could have growth and more social inclusion. It's a choice which direction we're going to follow. It's an analytical choice. Obviously, it is a societal choice. So, my big puzzle is how can we actually achieve sustainable development? Not why is it a good thing, why should we care? I think those are important to understand. I've tried to write my share of textbooks and articles and books about them. But I'm interested this evening in a question. How can we actually achieve them? What are we going to do? And I think the United States and Australia really are Exhibit A, because we have everything, our two countries. Wonderful countries and wonderful resources and people, and we could solve these problems without too much to do. Instead, you keep carelessly losing prime ministers every few months, and we elect Donald Trump to the presidency. So we're obviously doing something wrong, and the question is, what should we be doing right? So my view is we need a strategy. We need to engineer sustainable development, and I would put the following elements to that. Now, this is, again, the what to do, but somehow transplanting this into the Washington DNA is another issue. How do you get this antibiotic or this set of instructions into the system? I'll say some words about that. But what to do? First, we need clear goals. And here we're lucky. The world agreed on clear goals in the end of 2005. By the world, I mean the 193 UN member states. It's a little bit of a miracle how that happened. I was there. I can't explain it to you. But somehow the collective wisdom prevailed, and they made good decisions. And the SDGs give us 17 highlighted points of the roadmap, and the Paris Climate Agreement tells us to stay well below 2 degrees C warming and to aim to stay below 1.5 degrees C warming relative to the pre-industrial level, which was the occasion of that IPCC report. Second, once you have those goals on the horizon, then you ask, what do you need to do to make the system move to that place? That's an applied mathematics problem, if you will. You have a point here, you have a point here, you have some steering, and you try to understand how you can steer the systems to deliver the goals that you've set. I'll call those, for the moment, strategic transformations. A third point is measurement. One of the reasons that the planes don't crash is that aside from one in recent history, we generally know where they are in the sky. And we know where they're supposed to be, and they report in. We have a system of monitoring. And when they do crash, we have a black box recorder, and I listened to recordings of one of these crashes recently. Every airport in the region picked up relevant news so the investigators can go in and find out exactly what happened. We need social metrics the same way. We need to take our own society seriously, that we're measuring whether the children are in school, whether they're learning, whether healthcare is performing, and so on. Australia does a lot of that, of course, but now we can do real-time measurements because every day you can observe the land surface of this country and observe what's happening in land conversion, in droughts, in precipitation, in extreme events, and so on. And in other parts of the world, you don't have data for 3 or 4 or 5 years at a time in poor countries, but we could have the data every day. Google knows more than all of the official aid agencies and all of the official statistical offices in the world by the fact of monitoring all of our searches systematically. And so real-time metrics are now feasible. We need to make serious plans. Plans mean planning agency. I am advocating for a Ministry of Planning in the United States. You can imagine how that's going. That's a popular cause. But we actually need plans. The idea of the Soviet Union was central planning of everything. That was not a good idea. But the idea of the United States is don't you dare think ahead even one day. Don't think. That's communism. That's the idea. So honestly, I'm just trying to explain Washington to you. If you think you're planning, if you're planning, you're not letting markets do their magic. And of course, this is why we haven't been able to build a kilometer of infrastructure for the last 20 years in this country. We had President Obama, very nice, smart, decent man, who built nothing during 8 years of office because there's no planning that takes place, and you cannot build infrastructure without plans. So this is a part of what needs to be done. We need serious financial mobilization. That doesn't just mean markets, it means taxes, and it means philanthropy. And then we need to measure, evaluate, and update plans. It's stochastic adaptive planning, so-called. So we have the goals. What are the major transformations needed? Education for every child and social protection for those who are disabled or unable to help themselves. Health for all. Climate safety, which essentially means decarbonization of energy and ending the destruction of forests and savannas. Fourth is conserving biodiversity. Fifth is smart, sustainable cities, and you're living in one of the most beautiful in the world. And sixth is making sure that our modern technologies, especially artificial intelligence and the digital technologies, keep a human face, that we don't spiral into the end of all privacy, mass surveillance, and cyber warfare. And believe me, we're very close to that as well. Now, the transformations need to be global. You cannot solve climate change in Australia alone or in the United States alone. And poor countries cannot solve the problems of healthcare or education without the help of rich countries. This is also obvious statistical arithmetic, basically. I say in our interconnected world, each country has two responsibilities: to its own citizens and to the world. Trump literally does not understand that and does not accept that. America First is dangerous and delusional. And it is a perversion of tendencies of American grandiosity, but now carried to the extent to say we don't have to do anything for anybody. Well, the world cannot work like that. From those with much, much is expected, we learned 2,000 years ago, and it remains true today. The world cannot work if Australia or the United States or other rich countries turn their backs on their responsibilities to the rest of the world. Well, there's a lot of what works and what doesn't work, and I don't have time to go into it. But what doesn't work is privatization of basic public goods like health and education. What doesn't work is tax cuts for the rich and then not enough budgetary resources for basic needs for the whole society. What doesn't work is cutting foreign aid and believing we're going to get somewhere. What doesn't work, by the way, is decarbonizing Victoria or Queensland, but then sending coal abroad to be burned someplace else. That doesn't work, by the way. The atmosphere uniformly mixes your coal within 30 days. It doesn't matter where it's burned. So stop exporting it too. We don't need it, okay? It's no good for us in the whole world. And that means the responsibility is both at home and abroad. And similarly, what doesn't work is believing whatever happens in the rest of the world in my supply chain whether I'm buying tropical logs or whether I'm China buying soybeans from the Amazon. That's not my problem, that's someone else's problem. I'm just a consumer. What is required is co-responsibility of an entire global supply chain in every case, whether it's coal or whether it's palm oil or whether it's soybeans or whether it's any other crop. We cannot say that's someone else's problem. We just make the coal, we don't burn it. That won't work. Or we just buy the feed grain, we don't care that it's produced in Amazonian deforestation. Now, that's not how capitalism works, but that's how it's going to have to be changed to work in order for us to have the co-responsibility for sustainable development to work. But everything is a little more complicated now because of geopolitics. And I want to conclude my talk on Australia, Asia, and the world in sustainable development by talking briefly about the geopolitical situation. If you can look at this slide, the black line is the British Empire as a share of world output. The peak was reached at about a quarter of the world output in 1860. And then not so good things happened. And of course, the period from 1930 to 1945 was basically the end of the empire. And Britain went from being a quarter of the world in Pax Britannica time to right now about 3% of the world, and it's a fighting chance that that will continue to decline. And one could even, I won't say it, but you could imagine England all by itself for the first time in several hundred years as the end of that story, though I certainly hope that that's not the case. But this is to show, superimposed on this, the United States curve. So the US took over the mantle of British leadership and reached its apogee of about a third of the world output in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And that was the time that America America was given the idea of the American century, that now America would run the world. And America did many wonderful things, including, and I think most importantly, establishing the United Nations and establishing the idea of international law. And America did a lot of stupid unilateral things, like wars everywhere, by the way, that made no sense at all. Vietnam, Iraq, but the list is actually quite long and too long for our evening. That also comes with the hubris of being told that you run the world. Well, here's what's happening now. If you take the American century and put China on this graph, you get this picture. China was once a third of the world output, according to the macro statistics, back in 1820. China missed the century of industrialization, of course. It was devastated in the 19th century by the Opium Wars and by the extraterritoriality of the European and US imperial forces. And then the first half of the 20th century was more disaster for China with the Civil War and then the invasion by Japan. And then following that was Mao's disastrous ideas, which killed countless millions in China in the Great Leap Forward and in the Cultural Revolution, that devastation. And so China ended up going from about 33% of world output to about 2% of world output when Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978. But as you can see, it's been a pretty good 40 years since then. In fact, it's been the most successful economic rise in history of any major economy. But when you look at the map this way, you can see it's really catching up after 2 centuries of disaster. So China, as a great civilization and one that gave us so many of our basic technologies up to the year 1500, it's not surprising that it, in an era of peace, is regaining its prowess and its place in the world. Now, China's 21% of the world, or about 20% of the world population. It's more than 4 times the U.S. population. And it's not surprising, therefore, that it can be a larger economy in absolute terms than the United States. And that transpired around 2012, according to the IMF data. China's probably, at international prices, about 20% larger than the United States right now, in absolute terms, and about 1/4 the per capita income of the United States. So China says still poor, but the largest single economy in the world, and technologically quite sophisticated. Moreover, the technological sophistication of China is soaring, and the technology impetus of Northeast Asia, adding China, Korea, and Japan, makes Northeast Asia one of the great powerhouses of science and technology in the world today. Now there are 3, the United States, Europe, and Northeast Asia as the great centers of massive research and development spending. East and Southeast Asia together now represents almost 40% of the R&D of the world. That's good, because now China's investing heavily in advanced technologies, in clean energy, in photovoltaics, in advanced computation, in quantum computing, in electric vehicles, in energy storage for renewable systems. Indeed, China has made a list of strategic sectors that it is aiming to make huge advances in, and all the right ones as far as I can see. Advanced information technology, automated machine tools and robotics, aerospace and aeronautics, marine equipment and high-tech low-carbon shipping, advanced rail, new energy vehicles, new power equipment, precision agriculture, nanotechnologies and other new materials, and biopharma. We're going to be huge beneficiaries, by the way, and my children and your children and grandchildren will be huge beneficiaries of all of the science and technology that will come of this. So what is happening? Well, the U.S. is having a nervous breakdown is what's happening. Basically, this is supposed to be the America century. Where did China come from? They're not in the script. And the America century has at least 20 years to run. And so something's gone really wrong in this script. And that's the middle of the geopolitics that we're in right now. The U.S. is incredibly neurotic about China. And there is, in my opinion, no reason for that. I'll say it strongly, no reason for that. Is China an aggressive nation? It has not been. Will it be? If we make it so. But if we have normal relations and expect that China could have Australia's living standard, which, by the way, would make China at Australia's living standard 4 times larger than the United States, that would be tantamount to saying China can be a rich country like any other. And that seems to me to be quite normal. To say that China can't be so much bigger than the United States, which is what the U.S. is really saying right now, is basically saying we have to stop China's development. And that, unfortunately, is probably the best way to interpret what is happening before our eyes in recent months with these trade wars and the claims and the rollout of propaganda in the United States, including in Rupert's press, of all of the perfidious and horrible things to do. And you know it very well, South China Sea and all the rest. It's perfectly normal that that's America's sphere of influence. But if China so much as has any military installations there, that is aggression. Well, the United States has, I have a picture I want to show you. There are our military bases around the world. There are 700 of them. China has right now 1 in Djibouti. 1. We have 700. No, sorry. We have 800 in 70 countries is the estimated count. They don't tell us exactly, but the estimated count is about 800 bases in 70 countries. So the point is we're in a kind of mess because the first part of my talk was all about the things we need to do together. And yet, not only are we not doing those things, we're now seeing rising geopolitical tensions in a newly concocted Cold War. And the United States is aiming for that. And the United States is intent on pulling Australia firmly on the US side and to stop all of these relations with China, which are indeed very, very dangerous, ladies and gentlemen, except that they're not. They're normal that Australia and China would trade. And they're normal that China would, as a large country with the world's largest population and increasing technological sophistication, would be investing outward in the world, just like Britain did in the 19th century and the United States did in the second half of the 20th century. So I'll conclude by mentioning didactically the main theories of international relations that apply in this case, because I'm going to sneak in one of my own. It's not one of the main ones, but it should be. So one of them is, now we have no leader. And this is a theory called the hegemonic transition. The United States no longer leads. China doesn't lead. There's no global leader. Nobody attends to the public goods anymore. We have the kind of mess we have. It's not a bad theory. It was a theory that was applied to explain the Great Depression, because Britain didn't save the world from the Great Depression. It was already declining power. The United States didn't save the world from the Great Depression because the United States wasn't ready to have global leadership in the 1930s as it was after 1945. So one theory says we have a mess because we have no global leader. A more optimistic rendering, in fact, is Henry Kissinger's view that what we should have is a balance of power. And a balance of power in the Kissinger view is okay. China, US, Europe, and so on, as balanced, balancing and balanced. And I prefer this to the first view, but what worries me is that there is no natural balance of power. In a fast-changing world, there are imbalances or fears of imbalances, and indeed, the model of the world that Kissinger adored, which is the 19th century balance of power in Europe, fell apart in August 1914 and led to a century of disaster afterwards. A third view is recently been put forward by a former colleague of mine at Harvard University, Graham Allison, who noted that throughout history, when you have a lead power like the United States and a rising power like China, or a lead power like Sparta and a rising power like Athens, that one can fall into war. That either the lead power suppresses the rising power attacks because it fears suppression from the lead power. And that is an interpretation of World War I itself, that Germany attacked in August 1914 because it was scared that if it didn't, it would never have its place in the sun, surrounded by Britain on one side and Russia on the other. And so Allison asks, will China and the US go to war? And the horrifying part of it is If they will, then we have to write the books now because there will be no one left to write the books afterwards. We cannot afford, not that the world could have afforded World War I that we're still in the aftermath of till today, but we can't afford a war between two giant powers now. Allison does not say war is inevitable. He says that these are conditions that are unfortunately provocative and can give the grounds for hardliners on both sides to argue for the inevitability of conflict. Well, I want to put forward the idea that what we need is not balance of power. It is not a new hegemonic leader. It is certainly not war of the cold or otherwise of the two leading powers. We need cooperation. The problems of sustainable development cannot be solved country by country without ample cooperation on systems, global systems, regional systems, standards, technologies that can move us forward on that upward sloping green line. And I've recently written, just last week or a couple of weeks ago, published a new short book called A New Foreign Policy Beyond American Exceptionalism for America's readers to say we don't need global dominance to be safe. In fact, the quest for it is our biggest danger, our biggest hubris. It's not possible. It will lead us to disaster if we continue to think in those terms. So we need to end here a few things to make our world work. To end the US-led wars in the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, every one of them was started by the United States, I'm sorry to tell you. We should abide by the UN-Iran nuclear agreement. The idea that the United States is punishing countries for trying to get out of an agreement that under the UN Charter is the international law is how fraught our system is. The United States is punishing other countries if they trade with Iran as a matter, though that is the international law, that they should. Third, we need to stop the US-led divide et impera, divide and conquer, in the Middle East and Asia. And Australia is important for this. For Australia, your future depends on good relations with the US, with Europe, and with China. You're not on one side or the other. You're part of this region, and your economic future is absolutely, deeply implicated in China's success, not its failure. And this is extremely important, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's good, and it's a good market and a good partner for Australia as well. We need to abide by the UN and the UN Security Council. Don't join the United States in coalitions of the willing against the UN Charter. That's a disaster. We need the rule of law. This is the only way we're going to make it. We need to cooperate with China on technology, climate change, and biodiversity conservation. We need, by the way, in the face of the #1 political issue in all our countries, the #1 populist issue, migration, we need to address root causes. Root causes are wars abroad fed by the big powers, extreme poverty which makes people desperate, and growing environmental catastrophes. If you don't want mass forced migration, then you have to raise development aid, stop exporting coal, move to renewable energy, fight extreme poverty. You can't have it all ways. So we have to be responsible to the world if we want to make the world habitable for the people in the world. And finally, we have to increase official development assistance. Australia underperforms by about a factor of 3 compared to the international standard. We're supposed to be giving 0.7% of development aid. Australia, I don't know the most recent number, but it's something around 0.23 of 1%. Don't take too much heart that the United States is much worse. We're nastier, really nasty. We're giving right now 0.17 of 1%. We're spending 30 times more on the military than we are on development aid. And then some of my fellow citizens wonder why the world's not stable. So I want to thank you for the chance to share these thoughts with you. This is a wonderful country in an absolutely gorgeous city, and you have so much to be proud of and so much to lead to help the world find the way to sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey, and I think you can hear from that applause just how much people appreciated the comments that you made, and I'm sure that they will take up your exhortations, the focus on the 7 big transformations that we need, and the pathway that you gave us. We now have some time for a few questions.
Hi, Professor Sachs. Thank you for that. Just had a question. With everything that you've mentioned there, I guess it presupposes strong political leadership, and even then we're seeing that's not even enough, where even political leaders are trying to be brave, but there's a divisive politics that's going on. So there's also a lot of talk about old power versus new power these days and different social movements. So my question to you is, what do you see as the necessary factors or things that give you hope for the social or political movements that are necessary to make these changes? And as a bonus question, any role for large NGOs, because I work for one?
So I think that the chance of major political change in the right direction is, in the United States, is actually pretty good if we survive this. The only thing I'm really worried about is some kind of decisive Trump-led break with peace or with our constitutional order. And it's a real possibility, not a big one, but it is a possibility. If we put that aside, we have a young generation of politicians, especially a lot of strong young women who are coming into politics right now and absolutely telling it straight. And I think we're going to hear also, I would hope in this country as well, the young generation which understands these issues much more deeply. These are clearly the issues that young people have grown up with. Climate every year has been a disaster of some kind. It's not some vague theory. It's not like Trump, I'm sure, and quite seriously, I'm sure he never heard a word about this in his schooling, and so he probably doesn't have a day of formal education. In our societies today, young people will know and understand and learn about this. So it is important that we pass the torch to the next generation soon, and it is, I think, going to come from the fact that the issues that we're discussing are being discussed across the universities, are being taught on the campuses, are being studied by the scientists, and what I'm hoping we do with John and with our network is help to prepare the way. I don't expect any politician actually to have fully worked out plans in detail. That's not their job. But it is our job in academia, it's our job in the engineering community, in the public health community, in the education community, to be much more clear about what can be done. One thing I do want to mention is we're all part of the Anglo-Saxon world. It's a pretty weird world, by the way, even though it became seemingly the global world in the last 2 centuries under US and UK and then US leadership. But we believe in our rhetoric that we believe that markets will somehow solve these problems. So we're constantly invited to ask, well, what should the business sector do? And I do want to say that while business is quite important, and I am an economist and believe also that markets are quite important, real societies live on markets, government, and civil society. They don't just live on markets. It's only in the UK, US, Australia, a little bit in New Zealand, a bit in Canada, that we believe that markets are the first point of reference for almost everything. And that is a kind of handicap in our political discussion. So what I would like to emphasize in the politics as well is that we understand that what we're talking about here are societal challenges in which every part of society, academia, the government sector per se, as owner, manager, tax agent, spender, business, and civil society have roles to play, and to scope out much more clearly what those roles are.
Thank you. Another question? Question down here? Just here.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. That was a fantastic presentation. A little depressing, but and thank you for your comment about engineers. My father was an engineer, and he always said that engineers and scientists are the only useful people. Everyone else is a parasite. And which takes me on to my question about parasites. A lot of what you were saying there was about the crisis in political leadership that is not just in America, but in Australia, and we're seeing it in Europe now, and most recently South America. Africa obviously has issues as well. A lot of that is being driven by the media and certain really, really powerful players in the media. What are your solutions in terms of creating a movement around raising the expectations and the acceptability of how the media is conducting its role in democracy?
Oh, God. Is there an easier question out there? I don't get it, actually, because I don't understand and I don't have a good answer. I look at Trump and I say, I can't understand how anyone cannot see what a doofus this man is. He's an idiot, first of all, really, seriously. He's a fool. He's a crook. He's a liar. So I have a hard time. I'm not the best guide to understand this. What I do know is that he is enabled by Murdoch in a way that is so remarkable. But it's only a part explanation. Fox News is like a private studio for the president. It's propaganda, morning till night, every day. Okay, so that's an explanation. But why does anyone watch it? I don't understand that. And it's basically been a criminal organization also, aside from the harassment and the cheating on so many different things. But it has an audience of this core of voters. But here's another thing to think about. And maybe the system is broken in ways that we're not fully appreciating. Trump's base is maybe a quarter of the population, or a third at most. That's a lot, by the way, in a country, to speak to a strong third of the country. I don't know if it's that high. It's certainly no higher than that. And on most issues that we're talking about this evening, the American people split roughly 60-40 on the sustainable development side, sometimes 70-30. Do you want to tax the rich more? Yes. Did they support last year's tax cut? No. Did they support the dismantling of Obamacare? No. Do they want gun control? Yes. Do they want investment in renewable energy? Yes. Did they want the Iraq War? No. So one really important thing to understand is that we're not really seeing mass politics at work. We're seeing a kind of corruption of democracy that isn't just the communications part of it. We're also seeing a breakdown of public representation. The United States does this in several ways. One is that we work overtime to stop poor people and people of color from voting. The system is rigged to keep poor people away from the voting booth. Most normal countries, rich countries, have a list. And once you reach age 16 or 18, you're automatically on the list. And the government keeps the list. And you go and you vote. In the United States, it's not at all like that. It is, you have to fight like hell. People have died, of course, over decades and decades, over centuries, to try to have that vote. And that is part of it. Second, our Congress doesn't care about public opinion. Why is that? It's a little complicated, but the main answer, of course, is money. That the big lobbies pay big money for the election campaigns. So we have about $8 billion now in an election cycle at the federal level. And that's corporate money, that's billionaire money. It's gross, it's disgusting. And we rank a candidate, how seriously, even in the good press, by how much money they raise. That Beto O'Rourke in Texas is having a great time because he's raised $38 million last month. What a crazy standard. But that's how the system works right now. So it became a market system. But markets are not fair. They're not one person, one vote. They're $1, one vote. I don't even understand that, except for the fact that money seems to mean turnout or voter repression or other things. So it actually does seem to work, because it doesn't change public opinion, but it does seem to keep these incumbents in power, and that's what they crave. And then we have four big lobbies: Wall Street, big oil, big healthcare, which gives us a healthcare system twice as expensive as yours and much more difficult to deal with, and the military-industrial complex. And they just pour the money in, and then these politicians say whatever inane things they're told to say. Like Marco Rubio today. I mentioned that, didn't I? No, the Florida senator. His state was just slammed by the biggest hurricane in a century. And there's no doubt that the hurricanes are more powerful now because of warming, because the air holds more precipitation, because basically a hurricane is a Carnot cycle, and it is heated by the temperature of the water in the Caribbean. So there's no doubt that this is, and the sea level is a foot higher than it was a century ago, so the storm surges are bigger. So there's no doubt that his state was hit by human-induced climate change, and they're still searching for the dead or for people that are near dead and need to be saved. And what did this guy say today? I don't know what causes climate change. Okay, what do you make of that? Either he's a first-class moron, or he's an absolute son of a bitch. All right, I'm not sure which, but I'm inclined to think the latter, because I don't think that they're quite as stupid as they look in the United States. It would be hard to be that stupid as they look. And so I think they're corrupt. And so this is really a part of it also. What happened in the United States, we had a Supreme Court, also corrupt, by the way, I think, which is strange because you think of these people in their black robes, who knows? But they actually take favors and they go to resorts and they do other things also. So they're somehow part of this. And they have said in a number of cases that it's legal to give anonymous corporate money. That's just called free speech. That's crazy, by the way. The idea that corporations are people and people have free speech. If you could arrest them and throw ExxonMobil in jail, I'd go for it. But the whole point of corporations is that we give them limited liability. We actually give them impunity by law. That's how Trump is what he is, which is he took other people's money into his personal accounts and he bankrupted his companies because he's such a nincompoop that he couldn't make a successful business, but it doesn't matter because that's a corporation. So he had limited liability. Plus, his family cheated on $500 million of taxes, we now know also. So he's a crook, first rate. That's politics. Okay, we've got to break that. That's probably not mass communication. That probably is that what is really needed. I don't know how you actually break it, but what my theory for the United States is that a charismatic woman candidate for president in 2020 says, I'm not taking any of this money. And that's why I'm honest. And if you vote for this creep, crook, and liar, that's what you're getting. And that's what's going to start turning it the other way.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to wind up because it is past the hour and Jeff is about to go and appear on Q&A. So we have a deadline there, and that is a platform, Jeff, that I'm sure will be very interested in these views. We've heard from Jeff tonight about the good, the bad, and the ugly, with a bit of a focus on the ugly towards the end there. But Jeff, I think, also highlighted that we do have an extraordinary capacity as a human race to achieve and change. And I think we all want to go away and get on that green path, that upward path to sustainable development that decouples inequality, decouples environmental damage from growth. And we'll take that message away, Jeff, and you can be sure, I think there's at least 1,000 people here tonight that are going to go off and talk about what you've talked about tonight and hopefully get on that green path. So thank you, and thank you, everyone.
So my applause to you.